In this lesson, I want to focus in on continuing revelation in the modern church. In particular, how we respond to the voice of modern prophets. It's been one of the questions that has been the challenge throughout history, throughout time. Some have said that it's the greatest challenge of every generation, is how they respond to the voice of the living prophets. And beginning from Joseph Smith's day, through Brigham Young, all the way down to the filming of this video of President Russell M. Nelson, the central question in the restoration has not just been, do I have faith in Jesus Christ? But it's also been, how do I respond to Jesus Christ's servants who are revealing His will, governing His church, leading His kingdom as we move line upon line and precept upon precept in this unfolding restoration. I hope today to give some principles and some ideas that can bless us in this question and in this quest as we follow the voice of living prophets. I want to kick off by likening something that we're all used to, and that's where we put an address into our phone because we need to go somewhere or we want to arrive at a certain destination. We pop in the address and we put it on our maps and we start driving and we follow the GPS. And we've all had that experience where when we do that, sometimes we just don't even think. We just, it says, turn right here, take the next exit, turn left, get in the left lane, and we just kind of blindly follow it, assuming or making the assumption that the map is correct. Well, most of the time it is, but we've also all had the experiences where sometimes the map leads us down a dead-end road, or it doesn't even have the road where we're supposed to be on. We've all seen experiences or had experiences where even, particularly if you live in a city where the addresses are similar, where it takes you to a different part of the city. Well, why does that happen? Well, because sometimes a big key is this idea that Stephen Covey taught in his classic book, 7 Habits. He said that the idea is that the map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. Sometimes the perception doesn't match reality and it causes us problems. The map is a representation of the territory, but we've got to make sure we have our map right to make sure we're navigating the territory right. And sometimes what I've noticed using that analogy is that when it comes to following, listening to, and sustaining modern living prophets, sometimes our maps about prophets don't actually match the territory of actual living prophets. I've been guilty of it as well as I think many of us are as we've learned. Like, let me give you some examples. These are some things that I've heard people say. They'll say things like, well, if they were true prophets, they should have known that when maybe a new revelations are given or something is given that clarifies something in the past. And they're like, well, why didn't they know that in the past? Or they'll say, if they were a real prophet, they wouldn't have made that mistake. Or they'll say, well, Jesus tells everything that the prophet says, everything that the prophet does is because Jesus revealed Himself or revealed it word for word, voice from on high. Or they'll say things like, I can't accept so-and-so to be a prophet because time has shown that that prophet had certain biases towards certain groups or individuals. Or people will say, this one's always interesting to me, is people will say, prophets don't listen enough to the actual people and what the people are needing and wanting. They're in their own little private echo chambers. Now, on the flip side, I've heard people say that prophets are affected too much by culture or by what people say. So there's all these maps or perceptions about prophets that I hope to address and I hope to clarify and help us as we continue in the unfolding restoration, match our map with the territory as a whole. One of the first keys or first principles that I want to teach is this idea that the church moves based on revelation that God gives to His servants that is based on the context and needs of God's children. Let me say that again. The church moves based on revelation to God's servants that is based on the context and needs of God's children. Sometimes we don't like to think that revelation to God's prophets is circumstantial or that it's based on context. We want to think that all revelation is the same. But that premise undermines the very nature of needing living prophets and of continuing revelation. If revelation didn't respond to situations, there would be no need for a revelation on redemption if Adam and Eve had not partaken of the fruit and fallen in the Garden of Eden. If revelation was not based on situations, there's no need to call Moses to liberate the children of Israel from Egypt. If revelation isn't based on context, there's no need for the law of Moses. If the children of Israel hadn't rebelled and shown that they weren't ready for the higher law, there's no need for Jesus to give a higher law in the New Testament if a lower law hadn't been issued based on the circumstances and context of Israel at the time. There would be no need for restoration as a whole if there had not been an apostasy, if things hadn't drifted into generational error and keys and ordinances lost and changed. There would be no need to give the word of wisdom if there weren't conspiring men in the last days, as Section 89 says. There would be no need, by the way, for prophets to address the hundreds of times they have to address the subject of pornography if images and the internet hadn't become so proliferant in the mainstream. There would be no need for Elder Bednar to talk about flooding the earth with goodness and truth using social media, even like this, if social media and the internet and these technologies weren't invented. There would be no revelations on obeying the laws of the land if certain countries and certain laws and lands weren't established. What I'm trying to say is, if we take, as a lot of this video series has been, looking at the revelations to Joseph Smith as found in the Doctrine and Covenants, the entire Doctrine and Covenants is a handbook of God responding to situations, needs, questions, context of the time to move his kingdom forward in the circumstances that the children of God find themselves in. That is a big idea that I want us to grasp with ongoing revelation in this church. President John Taylor said it this way. He said, quote, "We require a living tree, a living fountain, living intelligence proceeding from the living priesthood in heaven through the living priesthood on earth. From the time that Adam first received a communication from God to the time that John on the Isle of Patmos received his communication, or Joseph Smith had the heavens opened to him, it always required new revelations adapted to the peculiar circumstances in which the church or individuals were placed." Let me reread that line. New revelations adapted to the peculiar circumstances in which the church or individuals were placed. Adam's revelation did not instruct Noah to build his ark, nor did Noah's revelation tell Lot to forsake Sodom, nor did either of these speak of the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt. These all had revelations for themselves, and so had Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jesus, John, and Joseph, and so must we, or we shall make a shipwreck. That is a powerful quote, and that's one of the benefits of having living prophets. There's so many more, but they are here to make sure we don't make a shipwreck, or maybe a plane wreck, as I will talk about later on in this very video. Well, what are some examples of modern prophets receiving revelations, responding to the current circumstances and context and needs of the time? Well, beginning with, we've talked a lot about Joseph, so I'll jump right to Brigham Young. Brigham Young needed to get revelation on how to move the church forward with the quorum of the 12 apostles, to finish the Nauvoo Temple, how to endow all the saints, how and when to bring them west. You can read part of his revelation in section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Has been canonized. When we get to the Rocky Mountain Valleys, how do we interact with Native Americans? How do we interact with the federal government when they make this a territory? How does Brigham Young respond to Johnson's army when they come in 1857? How do we announce and handle the public practice of plural marriage? And on and on. How does Brigham Young standardize the church so that it can flourish in its current organization? Those were all, and much more, that Brigham Young in his long tenure dealt with ongoing revelations in his circumstances. John Taylor, he had to majorly address during his presidency, how does the church respond to ongoing legislation from the United States government trying to stop the practice of polygamy and beginning to target the church specifically? Wilford Woodruff, he majorly had to deal with questions when he became president, like how do we standardize temple ceremonies? now that we're going to have a Logan Temple, a Manti Temple, a Salt Lake Temple, a St. George Temple, which was the first one. How do we do endowments and sealings for the dead? One of the revelations that Wilford Woodruff dealt with was the law of adoption. Instead of sealing themselves and church members to various prophets and apostles, Wilford Woodruff receives a revelation in 1894 that says, no, let's seal children to their parents, to their parents, to their parents, which changes the nature and direction of temple work for this dispensation. Of course, Wilford Woodruff in 1890 has to deal with the question of how do we handle increasing difficult legislation against plural marriage that is now, with the Edmunds-Tucker Act, seizing and going after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints itself, which results in Official Declaration 1 that leads to the end of plural marriage. If you want to know more about that, watch the video with Taylor and Tyler, and that I was a guest with them on there, or read the church's essays on the ending of plural marriage on that whole context. Well, what else? Well, I won't go through all the prophets, but just some other examples. Joseph F. Smith had to address by revelation, how do we end plural marriage for good? Wilford Woodruff still allowed plural marriages to happen, particularly in Canada and in Mexico. But in 1904, there's a second manifesto saying, we're going to stop practicing any new plural marriages in this church. Joseph F. Smith also had to deal with questions about Darwin and the origin of species and human evolution, which results in a prophetic statement on that subject, on where the church stands. Of course, Joseph F. Smith receives his revelation as we're dealing in 1918 with the Spanish flu pandemic and the ravages of World War I, and his own family has some deaths. Joseph F. Smith gets a revelation on the spirit world and the work for the dead that you and I can read in section 138 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Lorenzo Snow had to deal with how do we help our church that is still on shaky financial ground, and he gets a revelation in the Salt Lake Temple to promote and establish and teach the principle of tithing and make it an established practice in this church. Heber J. Grant had to deal with prohibition and the word of wisdom and get revelation on establishing that as a standard. He had to get revelation in the circumstance and context of the Great Depression. How do we help God's children globally in America and in particular within the church, which leads to the establishment of the welfare program. Of course, going all the way back to prophets in particular with David O. McKay, and they were dealing with questions with race and priesthood and the restriction of black Africans on priesthood and temple, which results in Spencer W. Kimball receiving the revelation found today, or announced anyway today, in Official Declaration 2, removing the restrictions, any restrictions on priesthood and temple based on race. Gordon B. Hinckley, the international prophet, the media prophet. How do we work with a growing international church? In particular, President Hinckley also dealt with how do we deal with the disintegration of the family, divorce, abortion, single parenthood, abuse, family responsibilities, questions about gay marriage that were arising in the 90s in particular, which resulted in the family a proclamation to the world. Well, these are just some examples, and there are many, many more as this restoration has unfolded of God revealing His will to His authorized servants based on the questions and the context and the needs of His children at that time. And what about our prophet today, Russell M. Nelson? Well, I could go on and on and on in this video. I do want to show you, take a look at this press release from NBC News when Russell M. Nelson was made our new church president. They say on NBC News, quote, "Noted heart surgeon Russell Nelson unlikely to transform Mormon church as new president." I just find that headline comical on multiple levels. First of all, he has radically transformed the church, as I'll talk about with you about some of those. But I just thought it was so ironic that not only do they misguess that he's unlikely to transform the church, but they call it the Mormon church. And one of the first things that President Nelson will address is, as prophet, is this is the church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We are not the LDS church or the Mormon church. Let's use the official revealed name of the church. What a great headline. Well, what are some of the things that President Nelson has received revelation on recently? Just a few, and there's many, many more. He changed home and visiting teaching to a higher concept of ministering. He combined high priests and elders into a singular men's quorum. We moved church from a 3-hour church to a 2-hour church. We said goodbye to the Boy Scouts. We said goodbye to young men's presidents. The bishop and the bishopric is the young men's president. We said goodbye to beehives and Maya maids and laurels and with the young women's classes. We said goodbye to the scouting program. President Nelson more doctrinally has focused attention on the temple and the ordinances of the temple and the purposes of the temple. He has made revelatory changes to temple ordinances and ceremonies to help members of the church better understand the doctrinal purposes and covenants of the temple. He's accelerated temple building across the world. He has helped lead the church through the global COVID-19 pandemic, the shutdown in many nations, new curriculum like Come Follow Me, home-centered, church-supported efforts. He's in particular pled for men and women to both understand their priesthood privileges, the power and authority and covenants that come through the priesthood and the temple in particular. Well, I hope to give some principles right now that helps us understand how God is working with His servants and working with us as His church as we look to sustain modern yet mortal prophets who are key holders. The first principle that I want to teach is this. Prophets learn line upon line, just like you and I do. All of us are here to grow grace by grace, line upon line, bit by bit. You can see examples of this throughout Scripture. You can see how in the Book of Mormon, for example, Mormon is writing about the 3 Nephite disciples who were transfigured by Jesus. And he even says, I don't know if they just had a change in their body or if they were put into an immortal resurrected state. And then later on he says, I've learned that they weren't, it's not the same change as the resurrection, but they were put into a transfigured state as a whole. You see an example in the Book of Mormon of a prophet learning in the moment. It's a mistaken idea to think that because prophets are seers, that they see everything. Remember that even Moses, in Moses' grand vision, where he saw the earth and all the inhabitants thereof, the Lord withheld it from Moses and said, I'm only going to give you an account of this earth, things that pertained to Moses' stewardship at that time. Prophets see according to their stewardship and what is needed in that time. For example, even in the early restoration, in 1831, section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord acknowledged this as His true and living church, both. It was true, and it is true, but it's also living. Those two words go hand in hand, in my opinion. Even though, by the way, the church was seen by the Lord as being true, even though we didn't have a quorum of the 12 apostles, we didn't have the patriarch, we didn't have high councils, we didn't have stake presidencies, we didn't have so many of the priesthood structures and organizations in this church that Joseph learned about line upon line. I think if we had bumped into bringing full circle from my first video in this series, if we had bumped into Joseph Smith in the 1830s, early 1830s, I'm not sure Joseph Smith would have known about or taught us about eternal marriage. I'm not sure that we would have, if we'd have asked him questions about a mother in heaven. Those don't seem to be doctrines that were understood or known in the 1830s. Those seem to develop later in the 1830s into the 1840s. After, for example, Official Declaration 2 was given, extending the priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy members of the church, regardless of race, Bruce R. McConkie, who had said that he didn't think that would happen until the millennial reign, came out and gave a talk where he said, quote, we, the prophets, get our truth and our light line upon line and precept upon precept. The second principle that I do want to touch on, that I've already touched on, but I want to reiterate, is that prophets do operate within culture. Prophets operate within the culture they found in based on the contemporary questions that are often driven by cultural context, as the major examples that I've already given you. Remember, God gives according to the conditions of the children of men. Take a look at Doctrine and Covenants, section 46, verse 15. If prophets did not respond to the contemporary culture and needs of the times, there would be no need, in my opinion, to have living prophets. A third principle that as we look at unfolding revelation in the restoration and mortal prophets is this: prophetic teachings can alter, and they do alter, as we learn line upon line and precept upon precept. And as further light and knowledge is given on certain subjects. As a simple example, the Apostle Peter in the New Testament preached that Jesus went to those that were in darkness in the world of spirits, if you look at 1 Peter 3:19. However, in 1918, as I mentioned, Joseph F. Smith receives a revelation and clarifies that, quote, "The Lord went not in person among the wicked and the disobedient, but from among the righteous he organized his forces to have them carry the gospel message to those who were in spirit prison or spirit darkness." That's Doctrine and Covenants 138, verse 29 and 30. Or maybe a more pressing example, since it's one of the major questions of our day, is our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. The church has changed some of its positions on that question. In 1981, the church taught that homosexual feelings and thoughts, even, quote, without outward sexual behavior, were a violation of the law of chastity. Today, the church differentiates between desires and actions, stating that, quote, feelings of same-sex attraction are not a sin, end of quote. Earlier, the church did have some thoughts about some of the reasons for homosexuality. Today, as Elder Dallin H. Oaks, President Dallin H. Oaks has summarized, quote, "The church does not have a position on the causes of any of these susceptibilities or inclinations, including those related to same-gender attraction," end of quote. Those are just some modern examples of prophetic teachings that are altering as important questions are asked and contemporary culture grapples with certain needs and certain questions. A next principle, therefore, as I'm talking about some of these, that sometimes people say, like, well, then they must have made a mistake somewhere. Yes, that's the next principle I would teach. Prophets can make mistakes. Remember that the restoration kicked off with a prophet of God losing 116 pages of sacred scripture. That's how the restoration began, was with Joseph Smith making a monumental mistake and the Lord having to work with his prophet, correct it, and find ways to rectify it. But as Elder Dieter F. Uchtdorf classically taught in his November 2013 talk, there have been times in the past when, quote, leaders in the church have simply made mistakes. For example, with Official Declaration 2 on the restriction of Black Africans and priesthood and temple, as we've touched on, there were a lot of things given, a lot of reasons or justifications or explanations for that restriction by leaders of the church that were perpetuated throughout the church. Today, the church disavows those theories and says that none of them were revelatory. And Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, speaking of this issue, said, quote, "I have to concede to my earlier colleagues. They, I'm sure, in their own way, were doing the best they knew to give shape to the policy, to give context for it, to even give history for it. All I can say is, however well-intended the explanations were, I think almost all of them were inadequate and or wrong." That's a really interesting statement from Elder Holland, showing that prophets can learn and grow and therefore make mistakes that need to be corrected in the ongoing restoration, as I'll talk about with you in the next video. Well, that leads to a big question, and this is the next question. The next principle I want to teach is that prophets will not lead the church astray, however. And that seems to be confusing, admittedly and understandably. How can we say that prophets learn and prophets grow and prophets can even make mistakes, but prophets won't lead us astray? This is a struggle, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but I hope that this can help some. This idea of prophets not leading us astray is as old as the restoration itself. When Wilford Woodruff gave the revelation leading to the end of the practice of plural marriage, he famously said in Official Declaration 1, quote, "The Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God. He wasn't the originator of that quote. Brigham Young earlier said, quote, "The Lord Almighty leads this church, and He will never suffer you to be led astray if you are found doing your duty. You may go home and sleep as sweetly as a babe in its mother's arms. As to any danger of your leaders leading you astray, for if they should try to do so, the Lord would quickly sweep them off the earth." Elder Ballard more recently said in 2014, "Keep your eyes on the leaders of the church. We will not and cannot lead you astray." And there are many teachings along this line that we're familiar with. Well, one of the things I want to talk about with you is what's the difference between leading astray and making mistakes? I think there's a difference, and this might help hopefully resolve some of the tension that's there. There's a difference between leading astray and making mistakes. If you take a look at this picture, here's a picture of my wife and I with our family. We have 7 children, and therefore we have made a lot of mistakes, and I'll be the first to admit that. If I brought in my 7 children onto this video one by one and lined them up and said, "Tell all the viewers of this video how many times your mother and father have made mistakes," this video would go on for hours and hours, I'm positive. I've had to repent, I've had to learn, I've had to apologize, I've had to grow. However, I'm confident that if we brought in those same 7 children and said, "Do your mom and dad lead your family astray?" I'm confident that all 7 of my children would say, "No, they lead us right. They lead us on the right path. They lead us on the right direction." I hope that can help see a little difference between making mistakes and leading astray. Leading astray has more to do with the direction, with the trajectory, with the intent, and therefore the result as a whole. Well, what do I personally believe it means that leaders will not make us lead us astray? I think central to the restoration is making and keeping covenants with Christ, coming unto Christ and living His gospel, and making those covenants that then take us into the holy temple to make the celestial covenants of Abraham. I don't think that the leaders of the church will lead us off of that path, the restored priesthood and its covenants, and taking those covenants and that priesthood to all the world and giving those. It's centered on covenants and ordinances. So maybe if I could say it this way, the prophet will never be allowed to purposely lead the church away from the revealed gospel of Jesus Christ, its priesthood ordinances and covenants that are necessary for the salvation and exaltation of the human family, even though there might be mistakes along the way in helping to bring that goal to pass as we learn and grow. Maybe if I could tap into my inner Elder Uchtdorf, if I could give an airplane analogy, the flight of the church is a little bit like an airplane. On its destination, its millennial destination, it might get delayed. It might be going too fast or too slow sometimes. It might be flying too high or too low in altitude from its flight plan, its intended flight plan. It might be a few degrees off, port or starboard. God is letting His pilots, His captains, His prophets fly the plane based on the situations and circumstances that they find the flight in. But remember that He is overseeing it from the control tower. He is watching the radar. He's messaging to His servants about what they should and shouldn't do and how to correct the plane if it does need to get off course or fly around a storm or deal with an oncoming unforeseen situation. The point is, He will not let the plane crash and kill its saints that it's carrying. He will not let it fly to an unintended destination. He will bring that plane with its covenant saints into its celestial destination, even though there needs to be adjustments along the flight path as a whole. Well, the last thing before I conclude on this portion is who determines a prophetic mistake? That's a big question. I one time was speaking on this subject, and afterward, it just so happened in the audience was a general authority. And the general authority came up to me afterward and said, "I appreciate how you're trying to deal with some of these nuances and complexities." But then he asked me a pointed question that I have not forgot since he asked it. He said, "I agree that prophets can make mistakes." And he said, "But who gets to determine a prophetic mistake? Is it up to us in our judgment, or is it up to God? And that is a question I would extend to you as well who are watching this video. Tapping back into the analogy of my wife and I leading our family. For example, my wife and I have a lot of policies, we could say it that way, or even teachings, principles, dealing with technology as we raise our teenagers. Every parent out there that's dealing with teenagers and working with them, you know that technology is a new modern context that we're all trying to navigate. Well, we have certain things, and I won't say them on this video because you'll judge whether I'm making a mistake or not, and maybe we are on some things. But what's interesting is one time, as we were talking with our teenage daughters, we told them they couldn't have a certain social media platform while they were young. We said when they reached this certain age, they could have this social media platform. Our daughters freaked out on us. There's no other way to say it. They told us we didn't understand. They told us we were out of touch. They told us we were ruining their social lives. They cried, they pushed back. But my wife and I held firm on that. Now, what was interesting is now some of those daughters are older and they're adults. And as I was having a conversation recently with one of my younger daughters who's moving into her teenage years, I said to her some of our policies. You're not going to get a cell phone at this age. You're not going to have these social media platforms, blah, blah, blah. Well, what was interesting is I was telling her that, just so happened that one of my older daughters was there, and she turned to my younger daughter and said, listen to mom and dad. They know what they're talking about. And then my daughter thanked us for implementing those policies to help her during her teenage years. So we have to be careful sometimes when we rush to our quick judgments about what is and is not a mistake. Sometimes we simply don't have all the information. Sometimes we don't have all the factors. Sometimes, and a little bit of information would turn our perspective on something. Sometimes we don't see a global international church. We only see it through our lens and our experience, which is how we all understand the world. Let's just remember and ponder on that question of who does determine a prophetic mistake as a whole. Well, last few principles as I wrap this up. Remember that prophets have safeguards also. When we say prophets can make mistakes and they won't lead us astray, and how do we continue to balance that? Well, prophets do have safeguards. And one of those safeguards is the concept of the united voice of the first presidency and the quorum of the 12 apostles. This is a standard that is established in section 107, verse 27 and 28, all the way through verse 30 of the Doctrine and Covenants. That's a revelation when the quorum of the 12 apostles was established. And they say that the quorum of the 12 forms a quorum equal in authority as the first presidency. And then in those verses it says, all the decisions of these quorums must be by the unanimous voice of the same to have power and validity. Now they do make an exception in that those very verses that a majority may render a decision, but the goal, the ideal is prophetic unanimity. Now, again, trying to be open and frank, there have not always been times in the history of our church when that guideline has been followed. There have been times where there have been unilateral decisions made by a president of the church, or even maybe by the first presidency. For example, back to Wilford Woodruff, when he announced that the church was going to end the practice of plural marriage in America, in the United States, some of the quorum of the 12 learned about that while on a train, reading in the newspaper. And they later had to be brought up to speed and briefed and discussed. And even then, there wasn't full agreement within it. This high standard of unanimity with the first presidency and the quorum of the 12, from the beginning of the Restoration to now, the leaders of our church have grown into reaching that ideal, in my view, and my read of church history. Well, President Nelson taught this. He said that prophets, quote, have counterbalances and safeguards abound so that no one in prophetic leadership can ever lead the church astray. And those safeguards are, one of them is this idea of unanimity with the first presidency and the quorum of the 12. Showing how we've grown into that as a leadership of the church, President Gordon B. Hinckley said it this way, quote, I can assure all members of this church that in the first presidency we follow such a procedure of unanimity in decisions. Two counselors working with a president preserve a wonderful system of checks and balances. They become a safeguard that is seldom, if ever, in error and affords great strength of leadership. He then goes on to say in that same talk, in the 50 years that he has served in the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, he has never seen a major decision of doctrine or policy or implementation in the church where this concept of unanimity was not followed. The last principle I want to teach related to ongoing revelation and sustaining modern prophets is this principle that prophets are authorized agents. Now that might seem obvious, but sometimes it isn't. I one time, when I was serving in a bishopric, extended a calling to a member of the church, and the member in my ward asked me, they said, Brother Sweat, is this calling from you or is this calling from God? And I said, well, I'll be honest. I said something like this. I'll be honest and straightforward with you. You know, we deliberated as a bishopric and we talked about various names that we felt could fit this calling. We prayed before the meeting started. Your name came up as someone that we felt would be ideal to fit the calling. And then as a bishopric, we unitedly agreed that we should extend the calling to you. And we all felt good about it. But I said, but we didn't hear a voice from God. We didn't see an angel. We didn't have, something appear in a vision. That was how we made the decision. And so I said something to her like, so acting in our authority, which we feel God recognizes, we are extending this calling from us on behalf of the Lord. Now that's a great, and to this member's credit, they accepted the calling and accepted the explanation. I think that helps a little bit when sometimes back to when I started this video with our maps, I do believe that Jesus is leading this church through clear revelations to his authorized servants, the prophets. I do believe they see him when necessary. I do believe they have visions. I do believe they hear voices. I do believe the veil is rent. I do believe that they are led in the same revelatory power and pattern as all prophets have been in the past. However, I don't believe that every single decision made, every single action done is by the veil being rent or Jesus appearing or speaking audible words from heaven. The Lord has invested and imbued and empowered his agents with keys to act in his name. They know his general will. Now it's their job to go bring it about. When you think about that word agency, agency means you have the power, it's not just the power to choose. Agency is also the power to represent. The power to represent somebody. If I hired an agent, if I was a musician or an athlete, or my agent would go out and represent my will, help procure contracts or do things and bring them back to me and say, does this please you, etc. But they would have power to act independently. In section 128, verse 9 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith teaches what I simply like to call the bold doctrine. He says this, quote, "It may seem to some to be a very bold doctrine that we talk of, a power which records or binds on earth and binds in heaven. Hence, whatsoever those men did in authority, in the name of the Lord, and did it truly and faithfully, and kept a proper and faithful record of the same, it became a law on earth and in heaven, and could not be annulled according to the decrees of the great Jehovah. This is a faithful saying. Who can hear it?" That is a powerful verse. My interpretation of what Joseph Smith seems to be teaching is when somebody holds the prophetic keys to bind on earth and in heaven, to govern the kingdom of God, that whatever decision they make, and they follow those principles, they do it in their prophetic authority, they do it truly and faithfully, trying to bring about the Lord's will, they keep a record of it, it becomes a law. Prophets can create law that becomes binding on those in that time to bring about the purposes of the Lord. Joseph says, this is a faithful saying. Who can hear it? Well, some people can't. Some people think that that might be too much power. Remember, prophets have been proven through a lifetime of faithfulness. They have checks and balances, and the Lord is directing and guiding if they feel like what they're implementing will not bring to pass his purposes as a whole. And with that principle, We have to just connect it as a sub-principle of prophets declaring and establishing the law for the time. We have to remember this principle. We cannot try to get ahead of modern prophets, and we can't fall behind them and follow past prophets. We need to follow the current prophetic law that is being revealed for our time. That is what we will be held accountable to. I recently had a discussion with somebody who was talking about something that the Apostle Paul taught, and I finally had to stop them and say, Paul is not your prophet. President Nelson is your prophet. And what is President Nelson teaching? We will all be accountable, and we must be accountable. None of us should blindly follow. We will all be accountable for our own spirituality, our own actions, our own beliefs, our own behaviors before God. Brigham Young said, I don't want you to blindly follow us as prophets. I want you to get your own revelation and your own testimonies about what we teach. But we also have to be very careful that we don't become a law unto ourselves and become prophets unto ourselves, as Section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants warns, that we all just create a God in our own image and walk in our own way as a whole. Connected to that, using this analogy, it's almost a little bit like, you and I, back to you can't follow past prophets and you can't try to get ahead of prophets either. You and I can't go on the freeway and hitch up a horse and trot down the middle of the freeway on a horse. And when a police officer pulls us over and says, what are you doing? I can't say, well, people have rid horses down this road for centuries, because that's not the current law. That's not currently allowable. That's in the past, and that's been taken away. I also can't get on the freeway and put my car to automatically go 150 miles an hour and pull out my digital device and just watch a movie as I tilt my seat back and relax. Maybe I have a Tesla or something that can do that for me and auto drive the car. Well, that might be where driving goes in the future. It might be. And we might be able to do that in the future, and it's perfectly within the law, but it's not in the law now. And if I do that now, I'll get pulled over. And a cop, I can't say, yeah, but one day, decades from now, this is what will happen. We are always held, and God will judge us based off the standards established in the current law by His current key-holding servants who reveal and establish that law for His covenant saints. With that, we always have to also, as a sub-principle, as we're moving forward, we all have to take a healthy dose of humility. One of the things that I try to do, and I admit I'm not the best at it, and I apologize sometimes if I come across as too declarative in some of these videos as my passion comes out for the restoration, is that, it's always good to say, this is my view, this is the way I see it, this is what I think, and this is what I believe. But I also acknowledge that I have things to learn. I also acknowledge that there's things that I don't know. I also acknowledge that my view is limited. I also acknowledge that I may be wrong. Those little phrases, those appendages help us. When I was a young college student, freshly off my mission, I took a philosophy class. And in that philosophy class, I'll never forget this moment. We were assigned to do a semester paper on one of the world's great philosophers. And I read all these works by this one philosopher, and I just disagreed with the philosopher. I just saw things differently. And in my paper, I just ripped this world philosopher to pieces in my 21-year-old wisdom. And this philosopher whose views and theories had changed governments and nations and economies. And I turned it in, I thought it was such a great paper, and I'll never forget the professor in class passing the papers back out. It was before the days of digital grades, and he was putting them on people's desks one by one, and he came up to me, and he looked at me, and he saw my name, and he saw my paper, and he turned it face down. And I thought, well, maybe he put it down because he doesn't want the other students to see that I just got an A+. Well, it's not why he turned it over. He turned it over because I didn't get a good grade. And the reason why I didn't get a good grade, written in red ink at the top, was not because I didn't cite my sources well, or not because I didn't follow a good logical syllogism in my arguments, or have supporting data behind it, or whatever, or that my English wasn't good. No, all he wrote at the top of my paper was this, in bold red ink: a little humility will do you good speed in your life. Then he gave me a poor grade. A little humility will do you good speed in your life. And I joke that ever since then I've worked on that, and now I'm the most humble person that I know. No, I'm just kidding. But I have never forgot that principle. And I do think it's always good as we wrestle and grapple, as we sustain modern prophets and recognize them as God's key-holding servants, and yet also acknowledge the nuances, the contexts, the learning, the growth, the mistakes, the laws, the improvements, the changes. As we deal with all these factors coming together, it's good for all of us to always have a dose of humility as we learn to submit to our Savior and continue on the covenant path of the gospel. As I conclude this video, maybe that is a good thing to focus on, is these prophetic keys. I don't sustain prophets because I believe that they see everything for all time. I personally don't sustain prophets because I think they have every answer to every question. I personally don't sustain prophets because I think that every single thing they do is eternal and will never change. I don't sustain prophets because I don't think that there aren't some mistakes that are made. I don't sustain prophets because of any reasons like that. I personally sustain prophets because I do believe that this is Jesus's church and it's Jesus's kingdom. I believe he is at the head. I have faith in him. And I do believe in the pattern of him calling authorized servants, investing them with priesthood keys and authority, apostleship, if we can call it that, to govern, to guide, to reveal, to be the mouthpiece as the church and the kingdom on the earth continues to grow, continues to learn, continues to progress, continues to respond to new situations and questions and contexts. I'm so grateful that we have living prophets, so grateful for their sacrifices, for all they do to obtain the mind, the will, and give us the voice of Jesus, to put us on and keep us on that covenant path when we may be prone to wander. So grateful for their examples of teaching us of Jesus and patterning their lives after Christ-like examples for us. That is why I sustain living prophets. I recognize them as the key holders to govern the kingdom of God. I recognize them as the ones that when revelation will come to guide the church and the kingdom in this ongoing restoration, that it will come through them. I hope this video and some of the principles helps you as you continue to follow modern, current revelation, modern, current living prophets as we all move forward in the unfolding restoration.